I'm Thanasi Kambanis. Welcome to Order from Ashes, the foreign affairs podcast at the Century Foundation. Today, I'm joined by Peter Schwartzstein, an independent researcher and fellow at the Center for Climate and Security. Peter is on the line with me from Athens, Greece. Peter, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Peter has recently led an initiative on nature and national security, which put together a bunch of researchers to talk about a burgeoning crisis, environmental crisis in the Middle East and its security implications and implications for U.S. policy. Peter, you have a real sort of front row seat to a slow-moving environmental apocalypse, which I think you argue has a lot of consequences in every sphere of life, including security. Can you quickly, to set the scene, paint for us a picture of what is the scope of this crisis in the Middle East, this environmental crisis?
Absolutely. I mean, it's kind of, even for people who live and work up close in the Middle East, it's sort of difficult to sort of fully do justice to the ways in which the region's environment is crumbling. You have in some places sort of desert that is advancing at up to sort of 100 meters a year, like truly sort of dramatic kind of areas in which the Sahara is just sort of eating into relatively scarce greenbelt. You have temperatures that are already sort of pretty inhospitable in much of the region that get that little bit hotter on a year-by-year basis, thereby kind of contributing to the sheer difficulty of life. You can basically break down these difficulties into sort of two compartments, one of which are sort of problems that arise out of kind of governance failure in the region. You have kind of tremendous air quality issues in cities from Cairo to Baghdad to Beirut, much of which is a consequence of just extremely poorly regulated industrial and domestic emissions, and as well as sort of extremely high levels of water pollution in practically every regional waterway. And then you have the problems arising out of climate change, a phenomenon that, for the most part, is not the responsibility of the region's non-energy producers. However, this sort of kind of potent mixture of sea level rise, increasing temperatures, ever worsening dust storms is combining with those sort of direct consequences of poor governance to just contribute to hazardous and increasingly unlivable conditions for many of the region's people.
How much of an emergency has this become? Because in a lot of regions of the world, we've been hearing warnings for at least my entire lifetime about the essentially the claim that sooner rather than later, life will become unlivable in this belt of areas that are most affected by environmental degradation. Are we there now? Are we at a point where it actually is going to become impossible to live with current levels of life expectancy and health in these countries?
I mean, the short answer to that is yes. I mean, the Middle East is a geographically large country with an enormous array of landscapes and climates. However, in some of the hottest and most inhospitable of those climates, I'm thinking of kind of parts of southern Iraq and Iran, for example, you already have summertime conditions that are so hot that even the sort of hardiest of residents can barely survive. I mean, I've interviewed family members of sort of day laborers and farmers who've dropped dead or become very seriously sick on account of the heat and the heat alone. And we're talking young men here. I mean, in many ways, it's a sort of a case of a frog in a sort of boiling cauldron. Like every year, conditions get that little bit trickier with sort of the occasional bit of relief here or there. And so for those who kind of live these conditions on a day-to-day basis, it can be extremely difficult to sort of see perhaps the dividing line between just about hospitable and utterly intolerable. However, the stats do not lie. They show consistent warming and sort of added to that sort of pre-existing degree of sort of unaccommodating weather. That's just sort of taking the region in places that no one wants it to go in.
So I just want to press you on this because you've been talking at a sort of meta level, and I want you to elaborate a little bit on the human impact in terms of health, quality of life. I don't know, what other indicators you've looked at, but I'm assuming infant mortality and life expectancy and chronic disease are exacerbated by this degradation. Can you give us a little bit of a sense of, for the hundreds of millions of people who live in this belt that's at a sort of edge of climate and misgovernance stress, what are the consequences for them as people?
Certainly. I mean, when it comes to sort of looking at the sort of day-to-day lives of people in the region, the group of folks who are perhaps most acutely vulnerable to this sort of potent combination of climate and wider environmental stresses are those who depend on agriculture. They're the ones with a sort of a way of life that is kind of utterly interlinked with that of the wider environment around them. And so the trickier conditions get, the sort of more their livelihoods deteriorate. In urban areas, it's sort of not always sort of quite as easy to sort of show the sort of full range of ways in which people's lives are being complicated. However, in a city like Baghdad, we know that kind of sort of worsening, ever worsening dust storms are leading to kind of an uptick in respiratory diseases. We know that kind of throughout the region, crop yields in some of the kind of more vulnerable agrarian communities are wobbling as a consequence of temperatures that are simply too high for many seeds to survive. On a sort of local level, that translates into sort of even more diminished incomes for what are already some of the region's most deprived people. However, on a meta level, just to go back to sort of the macro picture for a moment, that translates into sort of deteriorating food security at a time when populations are continuing to grow and at a time when many countries are already having to import crop staples on a scale that they can't necessarily afford. So just both to sort of arrow in on individual rural communities and many of the sort of urban areas to which many of them are migrating, and kind of looking at the sort of overall challenges that a state must face, kind of providing for their citizens sort of food and water needs. On every one of these spheres, life is getting more challenging.
We'll be right back after a short break.
What exactly would a progressive foreign policy look like in the Middle East? The lines of critique are clear. Providing realistic policy proposals is a whole other thing, and much more difficult. I'm Dan Ben-Aim, and with my colleagues at the Century Foundation, we're trying to ask and answer the hard policy questions and come up with specific proposals that move the ball forward. You can see our ideas and join the conversation yourself at our website, tcf.org.
You're listening to Order from Ashes. I'm Thanasi Kambanis, and I'm talking today with Peter Schwartzstein, an independent researcher and a fellow at the Center for Climate and Security, and also the leader of a recent Century Foundation project on nature and national security in the Middle East. Peter, thanks for being with us on the podcast today.
Thank you.
Right before the break, we were talking about the sort of scope of this environmental crisis, and next thing I wanted to ask you about is the implications of this. How does this impact security? How does this impact the sort of basket of hard issues that tend to be more the focus of policymaker attention?
I'm gonna come out before taking on the full thrust of your argument with one very small caveat, which is to say that the sort of relationship between environment and security is an intensely complicated one, and one that certainly sort of merits considerable additional study. However, in my many years of reporting on sort of climate and wider environmental security issues in the region, and sort of according to the work of sort of good number of other climate security practitioners, there is an enormous array of ways in which existing security challenges are being exacerbated by the environmental sphere, and in which new ones are emerging. Perhaps the single most devastating way in which environment is contributing to instability is in the ways in which it's sort of exacerbating and accelerating state failure. As we know, many Middle Eastern states have struggled for years to provide for the kind of water and food and housing and job needs of their people. And in making life in kind of rural areas that bit more difficult by reducing or varying rainfall at a time when sort of alternative water sources are already scarce, it's just sort of adding to the pressure on already sort of limited government administration. And so when you have sort of citizenries that are already angry and frustrated and upset with their sort of self-interested and sort of inefficient and incompetent rulers, this is the sort of thing that could just prove to be a bridge too far, like a straw that breaks the camel's back. And then sort of a kind of another way that this is contributing to instability is sort of a way that I've kind of dedicated much of my time over the past few years. And that's sort of looking at the ways in which kind of particularly desperate and particularly struggling people in rural areas are kind of increasingly vulnerable to the sort of intricacies of non-state armed groups, including jihadists in countries like Syria and Iraq and Sudan. First of all, we know that the reasons why people would join the likes of ISIS are intensely complicated. There are a lot of kind of drivers of conflict in the same way that there are a lot of sort of drivers of terrorism at large. However, when you have communities that are kind of already struggling and are struggling that little bit more because of kind of unprecedented drought, when you have communities that feel rightly or wrongly as if they're receiving sort of even shorter shrift than many of their peers in urban areas, it's the kind of thing that can just contribute to that sort of bundle of sort of greed and grievances and wider resentments that often do fuel the likes of ISIS. That's just sort of one sort of little sort of tidbit as to how this is contributing to instability.
I mean, I think this is a really important and hard problem to address because I think a lot of the most critical drivers of conflict and human misery are slow-moving forces that are they're never operating on a time horizon that people with the power to change them operate on. So, state failure is also one of these things where it's all sustainable in the short term, and therefore there's literally nobody in power whose term of office is 100 years or 50 years. It's they're all on 4-year terms, or in the case of like a Gulf monarch, maybe a few decades of a lifetime monarchy, but none of them are on the time frame of the environment and or even of state failure. And I do think this is something that I'd love your thinking on. It appears that these horrors are quite sustainable for quite a long time, right? I mean, living in Basra or even Beirut, frankly, should not be politically sustainable for the people who run these places to so abuse their citizens as to pipe them poisoned water or to gratuitously pollute their air so that they can't breathe. And yet they have done in some cases for decades with no political consequence. And the people most affected, as you have been mentioning, are also the least politically powerful bloc. They're not a constituency that is able to topple governments or even to pressure militias to behave differently and so on. So what's the sort of, where do we get a break even point or a catch up point where this kind of predation, at least the human caused part of this environmental catastrophe you're talking about, becomes actually politically costly for its perpetrators, and so would contribute to their overthrow or replacement?
It's a good question, and there's absolutely no easy answer. In that, it's become increasingly fashionable in the last few years to sort of talk more about or talk up the links between environment and insecurity. But of course, it's been a phenomenon that's been in play for quite some time. Baghdad, for one, has been growing at the most extraordinary pace in the last 17 years, but even before then, in part precisely because of those deteriorating conditions in agricultural areas. And the fact that Baghdad has become this sort of unwieldy, exceedingly complicated city is, of course, one of the many, many factors that sort of contributes to its many security woes. So first of all, I mean, this is just not a new crisis. It's just one that's getting so bad now that it's finally sort of reaching the desks of policymakers who matter both within the region and outside. I mean, a second sort of related point is, I mean, it's extremely difficult to know when the breaking point is because it varies a lot from community to community. I mean, we talk often in admiring terms about the sort of extraordinary resilience of a lot of the sort of hardest hit communities. Well, it's not as if they necessarily have a choice. I mean, it's a question of sinking or swimming. And many of them are dealing with conditions that for a decade or two, if not longer, have been so environmentally challenging that they would be sort of utterly unimaginable for many of us, again, within the region or outside. So, I mean, I'm kind of answering or non-sort of answering your question in an extremely circuitous way. All of which to say, I got involved in sort of environmental work in the region precisely because, to my mind, it sort of did a better job of telling the story of the region at large than sort of a kind of supposedly sort of superficial look at the general facts would. I mean, why does Iraq have water problems? Well, it has water problems for much the same reason that it's got problems across the board. It's sort of corruption, extreme mismanagement, sort of legacy of conflict, sort of poor treatment on the part of its neighbors and perhaps countries further afield. So this is, as you said, a problem that's been germinating for decades, if not longer. And the sort of unfortunate flip side of that is that any solution will have to be grounded in policies that are kind of able to stay the course, that are able to endure kind of changes in government, that are able to endure tremendous sort of political and economic flux. And that's an unfortunate thing because it's not always easy to imagine that.
You need state capacity in a region where state capacity has been eroded for decades and sometimes maybe fatally. When I hear you describe these crises, I hear you talking about a lot of them as sort of fixable, human-made crises, and I wonder, is your sense that even a sort of mediocre but somewhat functional state could address some of the basic mistakes that lead to air pollution or that lead to water systems that don't work, and that if governments in the region were able to do this, it might not solve the bigger problem of how livable is southern Iraq in the long term or how livable is Upper Egypt, but it would go from these things being lethal human catastrophes to being problems of discomfort that can be managed.
Certainly. I mean, that's one of the most confounding things about this entire kind of series of sort of interlinked environmental crises is that so many of them are not only just self-inflicted, but also relatively, emphasis on relative, sort of relatively easily addressed. It wouldn't take much in the way of time or energy or money to at least somewhat alleviate the plight of farmers in a lot of the sort of hardest hit regions. I mean, the money you could spend on kind of reinforcing a farmer's water security or kind of equipping them with kind of tougher, more resilient seeds to survive in kind of higher heats is a fraction of the cost of kind of dealing with these people and equipping and housing and employing them when or if they decamp to these sort of already overwhelmed urban areas. So we can do sort of a very brief sort of back of the paper envelope calculation and work out that sort of it's kind of very much in the interest of every state in the region to apply sort of manageable sums into this problem. The unfortunate thing that I'm increasingly seeing is that a lot of kind of governments in the region have realized that sort of climate change, again, this sort of like big global phenomenon that is kind of only marginally the responsibility of the non sort of Gulf states in the region, is sort of making for an increasingly sort of useful foil for many of these governments. So instead of kind of recognizing or addressing their own contributions to sort of the increasing inhospitability of the environment in many of these countries through worsening air pollution or worsening water pollution, instead they're kind of laying the finger or pointing the finger at this sort of big kind of global beast, which sort of lies well beyond their power to control. So no, that's the thing that perhaps has one sort of shaking one's head in sort of anger and frustration so much of the time, is that it wouldn't take much to make the lives of people that little bit easier.
Another thing that puzzles me and I'm curious about is, are there ways to make the remediations profitable for the corrupt people who hold power? So in other words, if you could say, instead of appealing to some kind of moral communitarianism, say, hey, local warlord or corrupt ministry official, you could make more money than you're stealing currently if you were to put in place a better water capture system or water distribution system that you could charge people money for, and at the same time fix this problem, or the diesel generators, or any of these well-known culprits that are they're there because people are making money off them now. Couldn't you help guide them towards an also half good but better solution where they make money off of something that is healthier for the community?
I mean, one imagine, yes. I mean, there's plenty to be of money and plenty of sort of financial opportunities to be had in climate proofing. However, even more than sort of appealing to the perhaps personal pocketbooks of corrupt elites, you can sort of appeal to the survival instincts of kind of many of the regimes that preside over regional states. We already, I mean, in countries from Iran to Jordan to Egypt, environmental degradation is already emerging as a destabilizing factor. So were you to be kind of one in the sort of corridors of power in Cairo or Tehran or beyond, you've got a very strong vested interest in, again, making the lives of people who might soon pose a problem to you that little bit easier. The problem is that much of this just sort of plays into the traditional sort of autocratic playbook, which is to sort of perhaps has that sort of inclination much of the time to shoot the messenger rather than sort of addressing the root causes of the grievance. And that, in the case of Iranian environmentalists, for example, who've tried to draw attention to the country's many sort of water and landscape problems, is precisely what's happened. Many of the most prominent ones are in prison or exiled.
You're listening to Order from Ashes, the Century Foundation's Foreign Affairs podcast. I'm talking to Peter Schwartzstein, who has just produced a major project that looks at the nature and the consequences of climate change and natural phenomena on security in the Middle East. We'll be right back after a short break.
Today's world is changing faster than ever. Old rules don't apply, and the new rules haven't been written. At least not yet. I'm Rohan Advani, and I produce the Order from Ashes podcast at the Century Foundation, a leading progressive think tank that promotes peace, cooperation, and equality at home and abroad. On Order from Ashes, we try to make sense of a new international system in which America no longer dictates the global order. Join us as we talk to activists and analysts on the front lines of the most pressing issues in international policy.
Welcome back. I'm Thanasi Kambanis, and I'm talking with Peter Schwartzstein. Peter, let's turn to what U.S. policy can do. Is there a role for American foreign policy in dealing with this emergency, this sort of slow rolling emergency? And how do you get a sort of an imperial state that is mostly thinking in terms of hard security issues, its military footprint in the Middle East, how to manage ISIS, where to put its bases? How do you get that sort of approach to incorporate the kinds of environmental factors that you've just been making a case should be a central part of our understanding and approach?
Well, part of it is appreciating that the distinction between environmental security and the sort of quote unquote hard security issues is an artificial one. Environment contributes to or exacerbates practically every one of the sort of security issues that do interest sort of policymakers, both in the US and further afield. When it comes to sort of internal instability, when it comes to civil wars in places like Syria, when it comes to jihadism, the links are pretty or increasingly well documented. So it's not much of a stretch to suggest that this is merely a continuation or an expansion, just in a sort of savvier way of kind of many of the policies that sort of the likes of the Pentagon already embrace. I'm not sure if you're sort of keen yet for me to get into kind of what precisely the US ought to do, but I mean, just so much.
Do it. This is the time. Get into it.
I mean, so much of it, and this sounds like pretty pathetic and meager at a time when kind of millions of people in the Middle East are already struggling from severe environment and climate stress. But so much is just like according the environment the degree of importance that it warrants on a rhetorical level. That begins as I write in the piece that I very much hope all listeners will read. That begins with sort of US politicians from the president down, sort of making it clear that the environment is an issue that they actually care about. A lot of the time, the problem in Middle Eastern regional states is rhetorical. The ministries of environment tend to be among the absolute weakest of government bodies, if they exist at all. The Iraqi Ministry of Environment was rolled into the Ministry of Health, sort of essentially downgraded a few years back. In Egypt, the Ministry of Environment is so powerless that, kind of according to a number of Egyptian civil servant friends, being posted there is sort of akin to punishment. So part of it is just like raising it to the sort of rhetorical level that its severity merits. Beyond that, this will require sort of tremendous changes within sort of the US's own kind of different sort of development and aid and intelligence apparatus. Now, this does not have to be, and nor should it be, a Middle East specific measure. I mean, as we've seen this year with kind of an enormous array of kind of headline grabbing environment and climate crises, this is a phenomenon that is sort of already hitting the US hard at home, and in the coming years will likely kind of hit even harder. However, kind of increased sort of understanding of and sort of appreciation of the ways in which climate can be a destabilizing factor is kind of necessary among the diplomatic corps. And then, I mean, without sort of going into sort of long laundry list of potential solutions, perhaps one of the most immediate things the US could do is sort of expanding climate finance opportunities to some of the more cash-strapped governments in the region, while also sort of expanding kind of US assistance in some of the fields where the US excels, sort of environmental monitoring, kind of the introduction of kind of crop of sort of hydrological tools, and directing them to the places that they're needed most. So yeah, without kind of absolutely revolutionizing the US approach to the region or even its own capabilities, there is an enormous amount that the US could and should do.
Well, so I read sort of, maybe this is the wrong framework, but I read like three elements to approach. One is the symbolic commitment, and it seems like President-elect Joe Biden, by naming a climate czar who's a important person, John Kerry, putting them on the National Security Council, it seems well on his way to that first step, to saying, like, from my bully pulpit as president, I will put climate and environment at the center of my policy. So step one, symbolism, that's seems to be headed in a good direction. The other two elements of a sort of successful shift seem to be attention and money, right? And this is where things get the rubber meets the road, yeah. Right? Is the Secretary of State, when meeting with the leaders of Iraq, going to mention things like water, or will they be too busy talking about ISIS and the safety of the embassy and the top 3 or 4 hard security concerns to include this on their list? And second of all, will there be money in that limited pot of money that an increasingly inward-looking America has to spend abroad, will there be money to spend on these kinds of critical long-term investments that might have few short-term political rewards?
Certainly. I mean, as you gotten on, I mean, this is where things get difficult, and in consultation with sort of a number of people who are significantly more experienced in the sort of policymaking world than I am, sort of trying to come up with a number of sort of solutions or recommendations that didn't require the US to sort of stump up a whole bunch of additional cash, because, as you say, that's not necessarily forthcoming. However, from kind of pushing US partners, including the Europeans, to pay kind of their part, to redirecting kind of existing streams of kind of American assistance, particularly as the environment becomes more salient, there is kind of a whole kind of bundle of money out there that is potentially tappable. However, just to go back to sort of one of the questions that you raised, I mean, so much of the kind of importance or the ability to actually kind of recognize the importance of the environment, to my mind, comes from defense or intelligence or sort of wider government officials making clear that this is not an issue that's a world apart from many of the sort of pre-existing security woes that sort of already command kind of major attention in sort of policymaker circles. If you're kind of heading to Baghdad and you're sort of keen to sort of talk about the sort of degree of instability in Iraq, well, you'd be extremely remiss not to talk about many of the sort of environmental issues that underlie at least part of the problem. If you're keen to sort of come up with solutions to the sort of extremely horrible, long-standing mess in Syria, I mean, without kind of overplaying, without exaggerating the kind of ways in which drought or other environmental problems contributed to the war in the first place, you need to have a recognition of the ways in which sort of extreme unhappiness in rural Syria contributed to what happened pre-2011, in order to actually come up with sort of concrete solutions for down the line. So I mean, it comes, so much of this just boils down to sort of time and time again hammering home how like extremely interlinked the environment is with the issues that we already deem sort of vital.
I hope our listeners look at your project, because if you go to the Century Foundation's website, tcf.org, and look for nature and national security, you'll find a series of reports that really, talk at the level that Peter and I have been talking about today, but they also really get down into the weeds about, civil society, the Jordan River Valley, Iraq's water problem. So there's sort of, Gaza's water and other environmental woes, and so on. And it really is, it's amazing to digest the sort of big and the small elements of this problem. When I finished reading all these reports, one of the things I took away, two big takeaways I got. One was that without solidarity, we're not going to be able to address this. Like unless we, in rich countries like the United States, think of the Middle East as being just at the cutting edge of a crisis that's also affecting us. So we need to help them figure out how to solve that problem there, so that we can solve it here. That was one big takeaway. And the other was that maybe it's possible to promote sort of climate aid or climate intervention as really being a self-interested venture. So I think in some of these reports, you talk about different American technologies that are at the forefront of addressing various environmental crises. So if you had American companies being funded by the American government to go and do work at the behest of governments in the Middle East, that's not really like sending money to Iraq. That's sending money to an American engineering company to do something in Iraq. It's a make work program for the U.S. And I think I'd like to see a paradigm shift where somehow Americans start to think of these things not just as being like good stewardship of a shared planet in which we feel solidarity, but also these things are to America's benefit. They're enriching and creating American jobs, and not just somehow being charity basket case expenditures that are flowing out to this region in crisis.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the point that I sort of flicked at, but perhaps didn't talk about to the length that I sort of at the length that I likely ought to have in the paper I wrote. It's that this is a sort of kind of change of focus or sort of expansion of tack that could and should be very much to the US and the Middle East's greater good. For the Middle East, this is sort of an opportunity to receive kind of assistance in a field in which it very much needs it. It's not to say that kind of many Middle Eastern states don't possess kind of much of the sort of scientific expertise and excellence that they need. It's just that it's not empowered and much of the time adequately funded. So with that kind of US demand signal coupled with various forms of assistance, this can be the sort of effort that can help the region in an area in which it very, very much needs some assistance. And for the US, there's sort of perhaps a twofold series of benefits here. One of which is that this is kind of a means for the US to sort of get out kind of ahead of the shark, like getting out sort of ahead of some of these fast deteriorating environmental issues, to sort of incorporate them into like many of its sort of pre-existing security concerns, instead of sort of continually reacting to crises when they're upon Washington. And secondly, and this is sort of again more of a rhetorical flourish, I mean, the US has, as far as sort of many people in the region are concerned, kind of horribly sullied its reputation over the last few decades. And while it's sort of always sort of tricky to sort of talk in terms of last chances, this might be a relatively rare sort of opportunity for the US to sort of reset the clock and kind of reorient its reputation in much of the region's eyes, because responding to an environmental crisis by its very nature requires tools that go sort of well beyond militaristic ones. And so this can be sort of an opportunity, as many people both in Washington and in the region have been crying out for some time, for a sort of a less military first and more sort of diplomacy and sort of technical excellence approach first.
Yeah, and the real change is going to come when the center of gravity shifts to a point where a sizable political majority believes that this crisis is a crisis and is willing to respond to it. And when and if that day comes, I hope it's soon, but I fear it might be a few more years away, then we'll have enough momentum to be able to, for example, ratify treaties, so that when we, re-enter the Paris Climate Accord, it will be actually in the form of a Senate ratified treaty that won't be subject to the changing, whims of each administration that comes in. I think we're getting closer to that, and the body of work you have put together here in the Nature and National Security Project goes a long way towards building that case that this is an inexorable and global and multifaceted crisis that ultimately implicates us all, for which there are solutions. It's not just the sort of iceberg of climate change bearing down on us that we can't do anything about. It is it's a series of problems that are within human power to reverse. Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to come on our podcast today.
Thank you very much for speaking to me, and I very much hope that all listeners will read the entire 9-part sort of report series that we've put together, or at least much of it.
Right. So you can go to the Century Foundation's website, tcf.org, and navigate to Nature and National Security, and you'll find Peter's recent project. And thanks for listening today. Until next time, I'm Thanasi Kambanis. This is Order from Ashes, the Century Foundation's International Affairs podcast. You've been listening to Order from Ashes, the International Affairs podcast from the Century Foundation. If you've enjoyed what you heard, please rate us and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. It'll make it easier for other listeners to find us and help us to keep producing these conversations. Thanks for listening. Till next time.